So we're on the topic of playtesting today. First, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am. My name is Sam Liberty. I have done a lot of game design work, especially around NGOs, academic institutions, and governments. So these are some of my clients: MIT, Northeastern, the Red Cross Climate Center, DARPA, the World Bank, and others. And the reason that I'm showing you these clients isn't to show how important I am. I'm not important. I'm just a game designer. It's because I wanted to give you a sense of kind of the reason that I take playtesting so seriously. So when you make a game or any kind of intervention for one of these large organizations, they're making the decision to put money into you and your process and your product, perhaps instead of funding other important research, or instead of, in the case of the Red Cross, feeding somebody that might need it. So when you're in that kind of position, it's fairly important that the client has some understanding or some reasonable expectation that what you hand into them is going to work and have some efficacy. And I never know if what I do is going to have efficacy without a clear process that includes extensive playtesting that I've proved has some sort of result. So not to say that other types of games don't also need extensive playtesting. They do, especially as you get into large studios and things like that. They need the game to go well, because if the game launches and it doesn't work, that's a serious problem for your company. So I think that the practices that I'm about to show you, although they originate in my process, are going to have an impact on everything you do. And the talk itself, just to frame it, this is for FIG, so I'm assuming that most of the people listening are making indie games. I leave some room for people that are working at larger studios or doing other interesting things like making art or small physical games, but I'm mostly framing this to the perspective of somebody making indie video games. So here's an overview of what we're going to cover. We're going to go over playtesting basics just to get everyone on the same page. We're going to talk about how to prepare for your playtest, which is a very important step. Talk about running the playtest, what you're actually going to do in it. Talking about the important data collection and debrief that you're going to run. Actually using the data that your playtests generate. And then if there's time at the end, we will have a short Q&A. So starting off with the basics of playtesting. So one stuff that I think most people already kind of understand, but I wanted to go over it just for completeness to make sure that we're all on the same page. And because it's good, even if you're experienced, to remind yourselves of these things now and then. So we're going to talk about, what are you actually playtesting? Is your game fun? Is your game balanced, or kind of the bare minimum that any good game needs to achieve? But doesn't mean your design goals is a separate question. So your design goals, or maybe your aesthetic goals, are a bit different than just fun and balance. That might be something like, I want the player to feel like they're really behind the wheel of a Formula One racer, for instance. That's an aesthetic goal. So before you playtest, all you have are your assumptions. And your assumptions may be good. You may learn that your assumptions were correct through playtesting, but you're playtesting to either confirm or disprove your own assumptions, especially at first. You should never trust assumptions, even your own. You always want to be looking at data. So you've probably seen a diagram like this before. This is the iterative design or game design diagram of the process. You design a thing, you playtest it, you analyze the data, and then use that to form the next design. But people usually, they talk about the circles, right? The circles on this, the dots that say design, playtest, and analyze, but a lot less is spent talking about what these arrows actually are. And this is what the designer is doing at these points. And that you cannot do until you've begun testing. So when should you playtest? The answer is early and often. So I talked about proof of concepting before, but as soon as you're done with a proof of concept that shows some promise, you should begin playtesting. And if you're making a video game, that means that you'll probably start playtesting your mechanics on a paper prototype. And a paper prototype doesn't necessarily mean literal paper. It can mean it could be built out of something else. It could have no materials at all and just play physically in a room. I've had people build prototypes, paper prototypes digitally by using ready-made things like Minecraft, which was pretty interesting and fun. And so on and so forth. It could use Google Docs. You could do it on Discord. That thing has become very popular now that for the past year and a half, people haven't been able to meet in person to play a paper prototype. But that's going to be the first thing you do is paper prototype. And the reason that we paper prototype is that it's very easy to iterate. They're very cheap and fast to make. You can see a problem during the test and change it right then. So there's like very rapid iterations. And it does not cost your development team any time to paper prototype. You then have a physical artifact that you can use to teach your developers, if you're not developing yourself, how to actually design or build what you've designed. You may, after you paper prototype, want a basic digital or hybrid prototype where you start building, because you're confident in your rules at this point, start building a digital thing in Unity or whatever platform you're using. It's very simple, kind of maybe like gray boxed with not really any serious assets. It may also be a hybrid that involves some physical or in-person things to add texture and flavor to the digital simple prototype that you have. But after that, you're going to be continuing to iterate quickly. You may want to playtest your horizontal and vertical slices, depending on how you're approaching development, individual features, individual levels. You may want a sandbox. You may want to do some blind testing, which is having players playing the game without any feedback or input from you. Later on, you're going to be playtesting your onboarding. Often onboarding is left for the very end, even though it's the thing you need the most. It's something that the designers in the room usually do physically or verbally or with paper during an early prototype. They teach the player how to play the game. But eventually you're going to want that built in, because obviously you're not going to go to everyone's house when they're playing your game and teach them. And then a beta test is kind of like a very large play test. And that's kind of your last major one. And then it's okay at any point to return to paper. I do this frequently. If I am far along in a game, like I'm at the point where I'm testing levels, and there's a feature that I've been working on that's been iceboxed and I have time to do, or it's a new change that players have been asking for, it's okay to paper prototype those and test again with a small group to get the rules right and teach your developers before you put that back into the game. All the benefits of the paper prototype at the beginning still exist at the end when you're doing features and new things. So who should playtest your game? It depends on when in the process you are. So at the very beginning, you may be testing with just your team. You move beyond the proof of concept, but maybe you work at a company that has a pretty large team, like maybe you're a dozen or maybe you're 100. I don't know. It depends on where you're working. Maybe you're just developing by yourself with a couple people, but you're going to be testing like that. Once things are working okay, you're willing to inflict it on other people. I don't mind if my friends and family see this, or people that I've tested with in the past. You widen it to your circle. These are people that you know and trust, and you don't mind judging. After you're confident with how that's worked out, you expand out to true proxy players. These are strangers, obviously. And what do I mean by a proxy player? A proxy player is someone that closely resembles your final audience. But of course, you have to know who your audience actually is to make sure that your proxy players are true proxy players. So like I said, they are strangers because you're not going to know your final audience. They are demographically similar. They maybe played similar games already, or are fans of certain genres already. And these are the people that you recruit to make sure that your game is working in a larger scale. Then you're also going to want to test with edge players. And who are edge players? These are people that are outliers true to your proxy player core, either because they're slightly out of your demographic bubble, but still might be interested. These might be people that are a little older, a little younger, might be new to the genre, and you're going to want to make sure that the game is appealing to this small group. They're not just to be inclusive, although that is good, but also because making it better for them is going to also make it better for everyone, and help you grow your audience. Edge players may also be edge players because they have a disability or an impairment, like color blindness or a physical disability. It's very important to include these people and to do it earlier than you probably think. And again, making the game better and playable for these people is going to make it better in terms of UI and UX experience for your core players too. So it is good in and of itself to be inclusive, but there are additional benefits that you're going to receive to your core audience too. Now, I'm not an expert in accessibility in games, but if this is something you want to learn more about, I can certainly refer you to people who are experts and who I've worked with. And I don't doubt that other people in this talk forum are experts and have already presented on this too. So back to this. We are now at the point where we've gone over the basics and we're going to be talking about what happens at these red question marks. What is the designer physically doing, preparing, analyzing, and so on to make sure that their game is ready for the next step? So the first thing you need to do is prepare for your playtest. So you need to get ready. Find playtesters. You need playtesters to play your game. Protect yourself. You may have legal considerations. Know what you hope to learn. Again, it's not just, was this fun? Well, great, sure, I hope it was. But every time you playtest, you should have a learning goal in mind. Getting organized, making sure that everything is going to run smoothly once you're there, and preparing your brief and your debrief to make sure everything is as smooth as possible and everybody knows what they need to know, both your players and you. So first of all, finding playtesters. How you're going to do this is going to depend on who you are and where you work. If you are indie, and you probably are since you're here, there are a lot of different ways to do this. You can use meetups, which I've done. I've done pretty much all of these. Meetups, Discord groups, Slack groups, posting on Craigslist, going to forums, or just word of mouth. Hey, I'm doing this. Does anyone want to do this or know someone that wants to do this? These are all very good ways of finding playtesters. If you're in a major studio or even a large indie, you may have more resources. So you may already have a large community of players from your other games, from the web, from your social media, from your own internal forums and Discords. You might post a playtester position directly to a job board, or you may actually be doing in-person recruiting at game conventions. Go to PAX, go to Indiecade, go to a college campus and actually drive recruitment. And this is an example that I want to show you from Activision. They really have their act together. This is a volunteer playtest, and they've set up this kind of elaborate website to explain everything they're doing and how it works and how to sign up, what you'll get for doing it with an FAQ. It's very polished and very together. I don't expect every indie studio to have this, but if you have the resources, something like this is nice. And there's a link to this in my presentation if you want to peruse it later. I'll make that available to y'all. So other important things about finding playtesters. First, playtesting takes time. It takes effort. It is very valuable to you. It adds value to your product. So compensate your players. It could be a small gift card. If you have less resources, it could be lunch. Activision showed a lot of merch that they gave away to their playtesters, but you should compensate them. They should know that they're going to get something for their time. You should be cognizant of where you are sourcing from, right? So what communities are you pulling from? Are you getting people that are only your friends, so they're just like you? That's not going to be representative of your larger audience. You need to do some work to make sure that you're getting the right kinds of people. You should have them sign releases or NDAs. This is to protect you legally. Even if you're a small indie studio, you should be people signing releases and potentially NDAs to make sure that they understand and that there's no legal question about who owns the contributions that your playtesters are making for your game. And again, all the more reason to compensate them if they're giving you valuable insights that you're implementing. It's good to be able to show that they were compensated for these insights. And lastly, if you're publishing research, which I have done, given the field that I work in, you need to go through an IRB process to make sure what you're doing is ethical. Most indie game studios are not doing research, so like I was saying, do they understand what they're doing? Do they understand what they're supposed to be doing? Does the UI and UX make sense? And so on and so forth. And lastly, aesthetic feel, the things that I was talking about before. If it's a racing game, do they really feel like they're in the seat of a Formula One racer? If it's a horror game, are there moments of anxiety and fear? Whatever your aesthetic goals happen to be, are they getting that? Midterm, after you've kind of proven those things, you're looking at things like balance. Are the choices and strategies that are open to players balanced? Do they seem equal? Are things too easy or too hard? You're getting feature feedback. Okay, well, what did you think about the double jump? Was it responsive enough? Did it behave the way you expected? Asset feedback. How did you like the sound? How did you like the graphics? Did you like the music? And there's a lot of different ways to ask these questions that we'll talk about a little bit later. But in the midterm, you actually have assets or at least early assets in, whereas in the early game, you might be gray boxing or using temporary assets. And lastly, player expectations. I told you the game was X. Did we deliver X? Does this feel like X, Y, or Z? Late, okay, you're balanced. Your features are in the right place. The assets look good. The game is delivering what the players want. You're really going to be focused on fine-tuning. And that's really, yes, it is balancing, but it's like the very minute balancing. When hundreds or thousands of people are playing this, is there something that shows up? If I want this game to last 10 minutes, is it really lasting 10 minutes, not 11? Things like that. Onboarding, as I mentioned before, usually comes at the end. And there's good reason for this, not just because it's an afterthought, but because you want to be onboarding. It takes time to make the onboarding, and you want to be onboarding onto the product that is the actual product. You don't want to be iterating on your onboarding 100 times every time you update a feature during a 9-month or 19-month development cycle. So you're going to be building and testing your onboarding, making sure it works, making sure it's bringing players into your game the right way, and things like retention. Can I change this? This is like maybe during a beta test. Are players actually coming back? Are we capturing them and keeping them? Or are players getting bored? Why are they getting bored? All right, so you're running a playtest. You got to get organized. Organization is key, not just so you don't look like a nudnik to your playtesters, but so you are focusing on the game and the data is generating, not on the logistics. And this often in indie design falls on the designer to do. I've done this many, many times. If you have a producer that can help with this, great. If you have an office manager that can help with this, great. But you do need to be organized, and the buck will stop with you, game designer. So you're going to want to set a time and place, obvious. Make sure you have space. Make sure that it's reserved, that you're not going to bump into another meeting. Have a single point of communication so that players are all getting their information from one source, so they're not have to juggling through emails and channels. They get it from one place in one source. This will help make sure that everybody's at the right place in time. Make sure that they know what to expect. This is going to be a playtest, so on and so forth, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. Provide an intake survey so you know who you are actually testing with. Provide that release or NDA I was talking about before to make sure that you're protected. Perform a tech check, and that's the tech check of the game. Make sure that everything is running, that it runs on the computers that you have, that it is not going to crash as soon as they turn it on, that all the features that you expect to work do, and also the instruments. And by instruments, I mean the data collection instruments that you will use to gather data. And I'm going to talk about that in great detail in a little bit. But you're going to want to make sure that that stuff technically works as well. For instance, if it's a survey. You want to create and practice your brief ahead of time. And I'm going to talk about that in detail in a minute. So you're going to have some way to tell the players to just set the players up for their playtest. That's called the brief. And you're going to want to have that smooth. And then lastly, you're going to want to know what you're going to ask your players, when you're going to ask it, and how. And we're going to go over all of that. So we're going to do a little exercise on prepping a playtest. So you can kind of follow along and do this for your own game yourself, but I'm going to show you an example game that I like to use for this. But to prep a playtest, one thing that you're going to need to do, or that I recommend you do, is to write down 2 explanations of your game. A short one for yourselves. So this is to orient you. And that's going to be useful for you as you develop your instruments. And then a slightly longer one for your playtesters. And that's to tell them what they're doing and what to expect. So here's an example game. This is one that I've designed. It is called Morphotrons. So I'll show it to you now. It's just a simple game played with playing cards and poker chips. It is a Transformers-themed playing card game that I developed a long time ago with a colleague. These are the rules. It's how to play. There's a link to this if you want to read it. But these are basically the directions. But what Morphotrons is a game that we designed to have as much depth, strategy, and tactical freedom as possible using simple components. It heavily invokes the theme of Transformers, so we want players to feel like their cards really feel like transforming robots and how they operate. Lastly, the game is complex, but the tight theming should make the rules legible and fairly easy to remember. So here's something that I might write down for myself for Morphotrons. Tons of depth, strategy, and complexity, highly thematic, and complex rules that are made intuitive by tight theming. And what these are my design goals, or if you prefer, the aesthetic goals. And these are used to guide the design of your data instruments and your debrief questions. The second is for players. So you're explaining the premise of the game they're about to play, so they're not coming in blind, but you don't explain the gameplay or the mechanics or your aesthetic goals. And the reason for that is if you do that, you're going to bias them and taint the data. You won't know if people have trouble understanding or learning something if you've told them what it is before they do it, because then they're looking for it. If you say, I want you to feel like these things are really transforming robots, it's really important to me, then later you ask, did it feel like these were transforming robots? They're probably primed to say yes, even if you've told them that you want them to be very honest. So here's something that I might write for players. This game called Morphotrons. It's a 2-player game that uses playing cards where you control an army of transforming robots and use them to combat your opponent's bots and destroy their buildings. Bam, that's the premise. That's all I need to know before we launch into the actual game. So right now, we're going to take a minute. If you want to follow along, you can actually do this yourself to write an onboarding script. We're going to talk about what you're going to tell your players in the moment if you do need to teach them a game. And if it's a physical game, this may be more important. Note that blind testing works differently. If you're at the point where the game is already basically working and you don't need to teach, or if you already have an onboarding built in, you're not going to do this stuff. So when I do an onboarding script, I work in this order. I tell them the goal. I tell them what actions that they may that they can do to get to that goal, how the controls work, and then any non-obvious rules. And this is kind of more important for tabletop and really early prototypes that need to be digital prototypes that need to be taught in a kind of intrusive way. So, for instance, hey, the object of the game is to destroy your opponent's buildings. To do that, you're going to move your robots up the field until you get to them and smash them. So you can, every turn, you can play a robot and you can move. You can also transform. Here's how you do that. And so it kind of orients them in a way with context. Okay. You have your brief. You're ready to run your playtest. How do we do this? So first, we want to set up expectations. They should know that they are testing a prototype, so the game's unfinished. It has unfinished assets. It might have bugs. It might be broken in terms of its balance. They shouldn't be expecting a final game. That honest feedback is essential. That the game cannot be improved unless you know what's wrong with it and what's good about it. That you expect them to talk out loud as you play. This kind of inner monologue should become an outer monologue so you can actually hear and observe better. They should know that there'll be a debrief at the end that they're going to stay for. It's nice if they know who will see the data and the records and how it will be used. We're going to record all this, but it's just for us internal people. We're going to videotape you, but no one's going to see the video except for me and my team. It's not going to be used in commercials. Or, hey, maybe I am going to use this in a commercial. Are you okay with that? Sign a release. That playtesting is valuable, that it's important that they're there, that we very much appreciate it, and that they will be compensated and how. Compensate your playtesters. You, as the designer, should be observing and asking questions during the playtest. And so that you're not just sitting there trying to come up with them on the fly, you should write some prompting questions to use during the test beforehand. So you'll use these if the players are not doing a good job making their inner monologue verbal. And it really helps you get into the players' heads. And these are things like, hey, why did you attack player A instead of B just now? Walk me through your strategy right now. Hey, if you did this, what would you expect to happen? And this gets them talking, unless you kind of really understand how they see and experience the game. How are you feeling right now? Things like that. So here's something that comes up a lot, especially for new designers. My playtesters are playing my game wrong. What should I do? What should you do if the playtesters are completely playing your game wrong? So in this order, nothing. Just let them do it because you're going to learn something by them playing it wrong. Ask them a question. Hey, why did you do that? Because you want to know why they're making these mistakes or playing it wrong. Probably it's your fault for not presenting the prototype right. And in an extreme or special circumstance, you may want to intervene. So what kind of circumstance would you want to intervene? If you're running out of time and you really want to make sure that you see a certain thing happen, you may want to say, okay, we need to move along to this. Can you please do A, B, and C so I can see how it works? If there is an actual bug that has broken the game and you need to step in and fix it. If you are playing with a paper prototype and you want to live iterate, oh shoot, I see that something that I made was broken. let's just fix it right now. I'll take a magic marker and change that 5 to a 3. Keep playing. And maybe a few other circumstances that may require it. But generally, if they're just not understanding what you're doing, you should be asking them questions. Data collection and your debrief. How do we do this? This is maybe the most important thing, because this is really going to be the output of your playtest. So here's a principle for you to know. It's called triangulation. So what this means is you want to be peeking. So you want to be peeking into your player's experience in 3 different ways. Because if you see the same data point come up in 3 different ways, that is a very good indication that something needs to change. So these 3 different methods can be any of your methods or tools that you have, any of your instruments. For instance, in this diagram, it's designer's observations. I'm watching and writing things down. The focus group that happens at the end, and an exercise that I run called Answer with Your Feet. But it could be a survey, an interview, and in-game metrics, or any 3 things. But you're looking for something that is highlighted 3 times, because then you can confidently say, this is something that should be changed, and I'm going to change it. So what are these different ways of collecting data? There are many. There are surveys, including your intake survey, to let you know who the players are, and your feedback survey to let you know what they thought of your game. Focus groups, kind of asking a lot of people questions and just letting them talk after a test. Your own observations, you're watching them play. You're a designer. You have a lot of insight into the game. Your observations are very valid. They're not the be-all and end-all, but they're as important as these other things. So things that you notice and write down during the playtest are quite important. Interviews, sitting down one-on-one with a person and asking them in a deep dive about the game experience. Any debrief exercises that you run. For instance, I mentioned one earlier, Answer with Your Feet, and we'll talk about that in more detail. The recordings that you've made of your gameplay, the transcripts of those recordings. You may audio and video record, and you may be able to learn a lot from those. Simple instruments that you've made, and we'll talk about those. They could be a checklist or a spreadsheet or something. Game analytics, things that you've actually built into your game that you can check. And I'm sure there are others that you might be able to think of as well. So how do we build? Oh, my son's coming in. Finn, what can I do for you, bud? I'm in the middle of something kind of important.
The tablet.
You're looking for the tablets? I think they're out of juice, but here you go.
You never charged them.
Well, you go charge them downstairs, bud. You go and shut the door, please. Thank you. Sorry about that. 2021. All right, so you're building data instruments in your debrief. This is basically a bunch of really robust ways to ask questions. So what makes a good question? They are neutrally worded. They don't lead the player to a specific outcome. Something like, did you feel like you were in the cockpit of a Formula One racer? That is not really a neutrally worded question. Like, it's pretty specific, and it's pretty clear what the designer wants you to say. So thinking of other ways to ask that question. How did you feel when you were playing this game? Giving them a list of a couple dozen different adjectives that might describe the game and asking them to pick them off a list and check them off. A good question provides specific insight that relates back to your design goals. So remember those bullets that you wrote before? For Morphotrons, it was the complexity made simple by the theme, the depth, the fact that you're getting a lot of mileage out of simple components. So your questions should give insight into those goals. Critical questions are asked twice in 2 different ways, because people sometimes contradict themselves. Maybe because you've asked the question wrong, or maybe because there's some texture to that you didn't anticipate. So if something's really important to your design process, ask it in 2 different ways. Maybe on a Likert scale, agree to disagree, or strongly agree to strongly disagree, as well as a simple question of how much did you like this? Or how powerful was this feature? Whatever. And that will give you some internal triangulation within an instrument. So surveys. These are fairly important instruments. They have a lot of benefit to them. I use them frequently. Some people disagree with using surveys because people may not even realize that they're not being truthful on them, perhaps because you've worded them wrong, or because they don't recognize their own biases. But I find them very valuable for a number of reasons. But you should follow these best practices to make sure that they're working well. So first of all, don't skip your intake survey. And that's, who are you? How old are you? Why did you decide to do this? Have you done this before? What kind of games do you like? This will add a lot of texture to their answer. You can also ask, can I contact you to play again? And then you've grown your playtesting community. Keep them short. People get sick of filling in bubbles after a while, especially if they have to type. And that means that the answers at the end of the survey might not be as accurate or valuable as the answers they gave at the beginning, and that's not what you want. If you do need to ask a lot of questions on your survey, you should break them into longer sections so people can tolerate them better. Because if they scroll down, Jesus, there's 100 questions on this, they may decide not to do it, or to, like again, with fatigue, not want to, so they rush. Use the right platform. So there's a lot of different platforms. Some are free, like Google Docs. Some are paid or freemium, like Qualtrics. They all have different capabilities. Go and investigate them and pick the right one for you. The best thing about a survey is that you can collect data from a large sample size. You can blast a survey to 100 people, to 1,000 people. They can all answer, and most survey tools tabulate that and visualize it for you, and that's quite powerful. The con of surveys is that it's hard to provide texture and follow-up. If somebody has an interesting answer on a survey, it's more difficult to immediately ask them, well, what did you mean by that, than some of these other methods. So an example survey that's included is one for a game called Rum Runners. I've again included this on my presentation, a link to it, but you can see kind of the questions they're asking about a lot of different features. But even though they're asking a lot of features, the first page doesn't even have any questions. The second one only has really 3. And the third one really only has 4, and only one of them requires writing. So you can see that this survey designer did a very good job of following these best practices. Okay, so we can pause here. And if you have written your goals before, write some survey questions as well. These survey questions should be based on the design goals from your previous exercise. So thinking back, I might think of some questions that I could ask about morphotrons to be in line. But since we only have about 17 minutes left and we kind of want time for questions at the end, this is something that you can do kind of after the fact, or if you want to run through this presentation yourself again later. So focus groups, another very powerful instrument. This is a situation where you have a room full of people and you're getting feedback from a lot of them at once. So how do you do this right? Basically, you're letting them talk. You ask questions and let them respond. Let them talk to each other. Let them counter each other. You listen to what they say and you record it. You may audio record it. You may take notes. You may do both. You may video record it. You use active listening. So that's when they talk, you listen, and then you say something, A, to let them know that you're listening, so they feel like they want to talk more, and B, to give them the opportunity to follow up. Like when you say, hey, it's interesting that you thought the double jump was like this. What made you feel that way? And they will often add more texture. Usually when you ask somebody a question, they answer. So the pros of a focus group is that compared to a survey, it provides a lot more texture. They're talking at length. You can ask follow-ups. Another pro is that you can gather information from a whole lot of people at once. So compared to like an interview where you're one-on-one, you can talk to maybe a dozen people, and that's a pretty good ratio of facilitators to audience. It's a pretty good use of your time. Unfortunately, they are a lot more work to quantify than a survey. You don't push a button at the end of a focus group and have everything go into like bar graphs and pie charts for you. You need to actually do that work to figure out what to do. And in focus groups, sometimes there's groupthink. Somebody might be a very powerful personality and they lay out what sounds like very well-reasoned or just confident critiques on the game, and other people in the audience might think, oh yeah, that's right, and tell you the same thing, even though that didn't happen. That wasn't their thoughts during the game. So be wary of that and make sure that you're kind of controlling the flow of conversation a little bit to avoid that. And note, it is not your job to defend design choices to the player. If they say this sucked, or this part was really confusing, or hey, this didn't work, why don't you do X, Y, Z? You as the focus group runner, even if you're the game designer, shouldn't say, well, the reason we did this was X, Y, and Z. We had to do it this way because if we didn't do it this way, we did that way. They don't really need to know that. That does not help them give you data. You're just listening, and if you need to understand what they're saying better, ask a follow-up. Otherwise, you just write down what they said. So what about interviews? You should definitely be doing the work to get very good answers. Don't leave the subject just like in the focus group. Think through how to analyze the data. So at the end of this, the result of the interview is going to be a video and or a transcript, or maybe an audio recording. How are you going to analyze that? Are you going to sit there and go through and find every mention of the word fun and put it into a spreadsheet? Maybe you are. Maybe you're just going to use quotes to put into a report to add some extra evidence to your team about why you're changing things. So interviews provide the most detailed qualitative info because they're one-on-one. You're really just digging into one person's thoughts. The con is that they take a lot of time. Unlike a focus group where you're talking to 6 to 10 people for one interviewer, this is for every minute of interview questions you get, it costs a minute of your time as a game designer, and you only have so much time. The other con is that it privileges certain people. Who has the time to sit down for an hour-long interview in the middle of a workday? A certain kind of person. So you need to be wary of that. So your own observations, pretty simple. While a playtest is happening, record it, take notes, and use an instrument. These instruments could be a variety of different things. It could be a graph that you're plotting things to. It could be a spreadsheet that you're filling in on a tablet or your laptop as you go, where the column is like players and the left right is actions they took. It could be just check boxes on a clipboard where you check off every time somebody laughs, or you check off every time somebody dies. Just tallying, same principle, etc. These are really simple instruments. It costs almost nothing to make them, but they're a physical artifact of the data that you take home out of the test. Game analytics, like in-game analytics. This is something that not everybody has access to. If you're an indie studio, you may not have it, or if you're a lone developer, you might not have it, and it definitely takes time away from the developer. They could be building a feature, but instead they're building these in-game analytics. If you have the resources, though, they're great. They're very robust and quantifiable. You can't argue with them because they're hard data of things that happen in the game, and there are a lot of different ways to capture these, and a lot of different things you may want to capture. The score, what level they got to, how long they spent in an area or on a screen, which features they used and how and when, track their keystrokes. So you could do eye tracking or biometrics, tracking their cursor, These are very useful things if you know how to analyze them. But what about a physical game? Yes, we're mostly indie designers, and a lot of you are making video games, but plenty of us are making tabletop games. And how do you build an in-game analytics? Well, your game produces artifacts too, right? Like maybe it produces a character sheet. Maybe it produces a pile of victory points. You can count these things. You can photograph them. You can take them home. You can take pictures at different stages of the game and actually look at the board or whatever it is you're doing. And these are the physical version of in-game analytics, and these can be very valuable. I sometimes sit there during a game with a stopwatch and time things and write it down. And that's kind of an instrument, but it's kind of game analytics too, right? So the last thing you might want to do is something called a debrief exercise. These are great in my estimation because they're playful, they're flexible, and they also provide quantifiable info. So one example of one that I run is Answer with Your Feet, where you have everybody in the room stand up and you ask them a question. Who thought that this game was easy? And who thought it was hard? If it's easy, walk to this side of the room. If it's hard, walk to this side of the room. In the middle, stand in the middle. They array themselves, and they basically become a graph. And you can kind of write down what they did. There are many other exercises like this that you can do, and that I can talk more about at the end if there's time. You can also research them online. But these are playful. They're flexible because you can edit them on the fly, and they do provide quantifiable info, but in a more playful and expressive way. So using the data, this is how we're analyzing it. Your playtesters have told you all kinds of information. You have recorded in all kinds of ways. So what do we do with it? Here are some best practices. One, focus on the why, not the why not. Players don't always say what they mean or mean what they say. Their feedback often comes in the form of advice. Hey, you should do this. Hey, I wish you could do that. But that doesn't mean that whatever the playtesters say you should put in your game, because A, the playtesters' ideas may conflict. B, there may not be time or room. C, they may be totally wrong. But what's not wrong is their feelings, right? Their ideas might not be right, but their feelings are genuine and legitimate. So try to figure out why they're saying what they're saying or telling you. And if you can't figure it out, ask. Look for 3 coinciding data points. Triangulation, as I said before, you're going to want to be measuring things in different ways, overlapping them. You should be bold when you're making changes to your game. Always try to improve it. I know it's kind of heartbreaking when you have a really great feature or a feature you think is great and then you realize it needs to go, but sometimes it does, and you shouldn't be afraid to make large changes. But that doesn't mean to make the game into something it's not. If some players are very dissatisfied with something and they're telling you, oh, it should be this, it should be this, they're pressuring you to move the game in a certain direction, you should be true to yourself and your vision, and remember that you are the designer, that you know what you want your game to be, and you should stick to your guns on the core of it. And last, when you're asking these questions or the filling out surveys, and you're asking things about like fun factor or the aesthetic goals, and you're giving them, I wrote 7 and 8 here, but like you could be using any skill you want. But 7 to 10 is not good enough. An 8 out of 10 is pushing it. If you are releasing a game out into the world that's going to be one of millions of games that are out there for people to choose from, why release an okay game? There are plenty of okay games. You need your game to stand out, or there's no reason to be making it. So you're not done designing until you are at an 8, 9, 10 out of 10 all the time. Yes, there's going to be an outlier that just hated it. Maybe the game wasn't for them. But when you look at that graph, you want to see a huge cluster of them at 9 and 10, hopefully. All right, so you've got the data. So what do you do with it? You need to translate it, quantify it if it was a focus group or interview, perform that triangulation, evaluate it against your own design goals, figure out what needs to change, make specific recommendations on those changes. This was the issue. It needs to change. We could do A, B, or C. I recommend B. And then you're going to communicate that to your design team. And that means making a report. Yes, game design work often involves writing reports. So here's an example from Run Runners. It's from the same survey as before. But here's the playtesting report. And as you can see, it's well organized. It has summaries of every section and what the players said, and data from the questionnaire. The report is many times longer than the survey itself. And why are you writing this? Yes, it's for yourself. It's to justify your decisions, but it's so your team knows what the players are doing and what the players are saying and what the game is becoming because of that. And again, there's a link to this in my presentation that you can use. So you need to then make those full recommendations and then try them out. And voila, we are back in the cycle. So that's this arrow in the upper left, making recommendations and trying them out. You're back to design and playtesting. So that's it. Looks like we have about 5 minutes left for questions. So I'm going to come back to this. Here I am. I'm going to stop sharing my screen as well. And if anyone has questions, please come right on up, and I'll do my best to answer them in the few minutes that we have.
How you doing, Sam?
Doing great. How are you?
Awesome. Really, really great talk. A lot of it, all of it, really. I just wanted to ask a question it's a little general, but I want to get your insight about it. I think you talked a little bit about kind of knowing how to screen your audience to avoid situations where a lot of people might have a certain opinion about something about your game that, isn't what you as the creative director might want, but I guess there's the danger that popularity might win out. In situations like that, how do you kind of I guess convince or show that, yeah, this is a popular request or popular sentiment or whatever, but these are the steps I can take to show you that it conflicts with our vision, we should leave it behind? Because I feel I think you mentioned it towards the end, it's just kind of sometimes popularity is a hard thing to fight, or it seems that way.
Absolutely. So this is one of the reasons that it's important to give that intake survey.
Okay.
So if you have, 30 playtesters, and you've given them intake questions to kind of sort them into psychographics or something, and you have all these people that say, I love, Overwatch or something.
Yeah.
Then you can say, well, the people that loved Overwatch were giving this kind of feedback. And I can see why, because the game is a shooter, but if you look at this group of people who didn't say they liked Overwatch, and these are the people that we're really trying to appeal to, they had this kind of feedback. And I think I can make a justifiable design choice based on this feedback and kind of weight their opinions more, and maybe pull their quotes, or choose them to follow up with your interviews. Beyond that, we always rely on, so I made a big point of saying we rely on data. So that's one way to get it. But your vision of the game is harder to quantify. But you have you've done the work previously to build that list of design goals, right?
Yeah.
These were my design goals. The team agreed on these design goals. We're all behind them, and we want to make this. And this patch of feedback does not match up with the goals. So even though they're valid and they're telling us things that they want, I do not recommend doing it. I guess one last thought is you may also want to perform some market research as well. And that's not something I talked about in playtesting, but it is something that game companies do. And if you perform market research, so yes, this game is popular and people are asking for things from it, but our market research does show that there's a large audience for this game. And I think they're untapped, and we're giving them something that's new and fresh and that they're going to like. You can point to that market research too as a way to justify with data.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Great. You're welcome.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is now 6:01. Hope everybody enjoyed the talk. Like I said, I will send out the link for the slides so everyone can use them and go over them. And enjoy the rest of the talks, folks.